Hello and welcome to Skyline. I'm Driti Atri. Tonight, the whole West Asia that looks closer to the edge than it has in a very long time. Every day there is a new missile strike. Every day there is a new threat. Every day there's a new warning. And now something even more alarming is happening behind the scenes. Tonight, we connect all the dots and bring you to the developments shaping one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. Well, let's begin with the story that has triggered outrage in India and raised serious questions about American military operations in the Gulf region. Can you imagine being hundreds of kilometers away from home? No family nearby, no immediate help, just endless water in every direction. And suddenly, your ship, it comes under an attack. Well, that nightmare became reality for 24 Indian sailors aboard a tanker near Oman. According to reports, the vessel it was stuck during a U.S. military operation in the Gulf, triggering a diplomatic controversy between New Delhi and Washington here. Well, this whole incident, it has drawn attention because Indian crew members, they were on board when the tanker was hit. Ladies and gentlemen, reports suggest that 3 sailors, they still remain unaccounted for. Can you think about that for a moment here? 3 families are still waiting for answers. 3 families are still hoping for good news, and that is why this story has become much bigger than a military incident at the sea. In the meantime, India has responded very strongly by summoning a senior American diplomat and lodging a formal protest. In fact, such diplomatic steps, they are usually reserved for serious situations. The message appears clear here. Indian lives should not become casualties of a growing conflict in the Gulf. This whole incident is also highlighting the risks faced by thousands of Indian seafarers who are working across the global shipping routes. Nearly every major shipping company employs Indian sailors, and many of them, they do operate through some of the world's most dangerous maritime corridors. What was once a military confrontation between the nations, it is now affecting ordinary people who are just trying to do their jobs. What makes this story even more worrying is that this is reportedly the second maritime emergency involving an Indian sailor in just a few days. The Gulf region, it is one of the world's most important shipping lanes. In fact, millions of barrels of oil passes through these waters every single day. Any military escalation over here, it does not just affect the whole West Asia. Well, it affects the entire world. It affects global trade, energy price, workers from dozens of countries. Now for India, which has one of the world's largest seafaring community, the stakes, they are specifically very, very high. But yes, while India is protesting a strike on a ship carrying its citizens, Iran claims it is carrying out strikes on something much bigger: America's military network across the Gulf. That's right. What happens when one of the world's most powerful militaries, they are challenged by a regional rival? That is the question being asked after Iran claimed it successfully struck key American military facilities in Bahrain using advanced drones. According to Iranian sources here, the operation targeted strategic installation, including an airbase and a radar facility. Tehran says that its next-generation drones, they were specifically designed to evade sophisticated air defense systems like United States Patriot. Here, Iran is even claiming that a significant percentage of its intended targets, they were successfully hit. Well, if that is true, that would represent a major propaganda victory for Tehran and raise serious question about the effectiveness of regional air defense network. Well, whether all these claims they can be independently verified or not, the message from Tehran, unmistakable. Well, Iran wants the world to believe that American military assets, they are not untouchable. And in modern warfare, perception matters almost as much as reality. If Iran can convince its allies and adversaries that the US bases are vulnerable, it gains psychological leverage even before the next battle begins. This also comes at a time when drone warfare, it is changing the nature of military confrontation here. Well, relatively inexpensive drones, they are increasingly being used just to challenge the very expensive air defense system. Well, we have seen this trend in Ukraine, Russia, the whole West Asia and elsewhere. Iran has now invested heavily in drone technology over the past few decades, and it now sees those investments as paying strategic dividends here. And yes, while Iran claims success against American targets, another strike has raised serious concern inside Israel itself. For years, Israeli air bases have been viewed as some of the most protected military facilities in the region, right? But now, satellite images and official statements, they have put one particular base under a spotlight. Well, Israel has confirmed that Ramat David Air Base, it was struck during Iran's latest missile barrage. Now, while military officials say that the operations continued and no injury was reported, this whole incident, it has raised serious questions. How did a strategically important military facility end up taking a hit? Ramat David, it is not just another airbase. It plays a key role in Israel's air operations and regional defense posture. The base, it has long been considered an important component of Israel's military infrastructure. So even limited damage at such a facility, it attracts international attention because it suggests that no target is completely immune during a large-scale missile exchange. In fact, the timing, that makes the whole story even more significant here. It comes after weeks of escalating exchanges between Iran and Israel. Every missile launch, it is now being watched very closely. Every strike is being analyzed. Military planners across the world, they are studying how modern missile systems perform against some of the most advanced air defense networks ever built. Well, the broader concern is not simply damage to one base here. It is the possibility that each successful strike encourages further escalation. Now, in conflicts like these, every attack creates pressure for retaliation, and every retaliation increases the risk of a wider war. But if the strike on an Israeli airbase was alarming, Iran's next move, it appears even more dramatic. Well, while military experts, they discuss modern missile warfare, one factor matters more than almost anything else: speed. And that is exactly why Iran's latest missile launch, it is attracting so much attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Iran has reportedly used its advanced Khyber Khatin ballistic missile in strikes targeting the American position. That's right, unlike the older missile system that requires lengthy preparation and fueling procedure, these solid fuel missiles, they can be launched very quickly and with very little warning. The missiles, they are designed to emerge from underground facility, launch within minutes and relocate before the enemy forces can respond. And that makes them significantly harder to neutralize here. In the meantime, military analysts say that mobility is becoming one of the most key factors in the modern warfare because stationary targets, they are increasingly vulnerable to surveillance and precision strike. Here Iran, it is basically showcasing that these weapons, they are not just military tools, but they are as symbols of deterrence. Iran wants adversaries just to understand that it possesses the capability to strike very, very quickly and at a very long range. Now, for Washington, these developments highlight the growing sophistication of Iran's missile program. For Gulf nations, they enforce concern that any future conflict, it could spread rapidly across the region. And perhaps the most important part, that these missiles, they demonstrate how warfare is changing. Conflicts today, they are increasingly driven by technology, mobility, precision rather than sheer numbers alone here. And as missiles fly across the region, Mr. Donald Trump is making headlines for a very different reason this time. Well, in the middle of an already tense conflict, one statement, it can sometimes create almost as much as controversy as a missile strike. And that is exactly what happened after Mr. Trump, he made comments about operations linked to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Ladies and gentlemen, here Mr. Trump, he suggested that the United States had removed millions of barrels of oil and targeted a lot of ships during regional operations. Well, this remark, it immediately attracted attention because the Strait of Hormuz, it is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply, it passes through this particular narrow waterway. If shipping is disrupted over here, energy prices can rise across the globe, and that too within days. Countries in Asia, countries in Europe, and maybe beyond, they depend heavily on energy flowing from these routes only. And that is why every new military development in Hormuz, it is watched very closely by everyone, traders, governments, businessmen, etc. Mr. Trump's comments, they have also reignited debate over America's strategy in the region though. Here, supporters argue that strong actions deter adversaries, but critics worry that aggressive measures they could further destabilize energy market and increase the pressure of a wider confrontation. Well, the bigger question now is whether the military conflict could eventually spill over into a broader energy crisis or not. Because if oil flows are interrupted for a prolonged period, the economic consequences it could be felt far beyond the West Asia. But yes, while Washington and Tehran exchange the threats, another global power is stepping into the whole conversation. China. When China speaks during major international crises, the world pays attention. And this week, Beijing has issued yet another warning regarding the growing confrontation between the US and Iran. Here, Chinese officials they have urged all the sides to exercise restraint and return to diplomacy. While Beijing has reportedly expressed concern that continued military escalation it could destabilize the entire region. This is the second warning from China in a matter of days, showing just how seriously it is viewing the whole situation. Here, China's position, it is not really surprising. Why? Because the country imports large amount of energy from the whole West Asia. In fact, the country has invested billions of dollars across the region through infrastructure and the trade projects. While a wider conflict could strengthen supply chain, increase the oil prices, and create a lot of uncertainty for the global economy. Simply put, instability in the Gulf, it is bad for business, and China has a lot of business in the region. At the very same time, China is also trying to position itself as a responsible global power. While Washington and Tehran exchange the threats here, China is presenting itself as basically a voice for dialogue and negotiations. Now, whether that particular message it is successful, that remains to be seen, but one thing is definitely clear. Well, the world's second largest economy, it does not want this conflict to spiral out of control. Now, for many observers, China's warning, it also highlights a larger reality here. The whole West Asia, it is no longer just a regional issue. Every major power now has economic, strategic, and political interest over there. And that means every new missile strike, it is being watched not just in Washington and Tehran, but also in Beijing, in Moscow, in Brussels, and beyond. But tensions are not limited to Iran and America here. Another major dispute is now unfolding between two of Washington's closest regional partners. The relationship between Turkey and Israel, it appears to be getting worse by the day. Turkish President Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he accused Israel of pursuing the policies that threaten Turkey's national interest, basically triggering a fresh diplomatic confrontation between the two of the world's most famous and influential countries. Here, Mr. Erdogan, he urges that Israeli military operations in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, that is creating a lot of instability across the region. According to him, that instability, it could eventually affect Turkey directly. These remarks reflect growing frustration in Ankara over Israel's regional actions and the broader direction of the whole West Asian politics. However, Israel has strongly rejected those accusations here. Israeli leaders have fired back with their own criticism of Mr. Erdogan, basically accusing him of inflammatory rhetoric and attempting to distract from Turkey's domestic and regional challenges here. Well, the result is another war of words between the two countries whose relationship has always been on a very bad tone. What makes this whole story very important is that both Turkey and Israel, they are major military powers with significant influence in the region. Both have historically maintained close ties with the US. Yet today, they find themselves increasingly at odds over security diplomacy and the future of West Asia. Here, many analysts believe that neither side wants a direct confrontation. But when leaders exchange increasingly strong statements, tension can take on a life of their own. And in a region already facing multiple crises simultaneously, another major dispute, it is the last thing anybody else needs. And then came a surprising intervention from the US President, Mr. Donald Trump himself. At a time when tension between Turkey and Israel are rising, Mr. Trump is trying to lower the temperature here. Well, responding to questions about the growing dispute, Mr. Trump said that he does not believe a military confrontation would occur while he remains the president. What caught many people's attention? It was his description of Turkish President Erdogan. Mr. Trump called him a strong leader and referred to him as a friend. Given the increasingly harsh rhetoric coming from Ankara towards Israel, those comments, they immediately attracted global attention. Well, Trump's argument, that's simple. He believes that personal relationships between leaders, it can help prevent the conflicts from escalation. Well, according to him, Erdogan do respect him, and that mutual understanding, it would help just to avoid a larger crisis between Turkey and Israel. Now, whether that confidence is justified, that remains to be seen. But critics do argue that international politics, it is often more complicated than personal friendship. However, supporters, they point to Mr. Trump's past relationship with world leaders as quite an evidence that diplomacy, it can sometimes work through the personal connection. Ladies and gentlemen, the bigger significance of Trump's remarks, it is that they reveal growing concern in Washington. American policymakers know that a direct confrontation between Turkey and Israel, it would dramatically complicate an already volatile regional situation. For now, Mr. Trump's comments appear aimed at reassuring allies and calming the fear of another major flashpoint. And finally, tonight, we move from West Asia to East Asia, where Taiwan is preparing for what it sees as the biggest security challenges. Well, imagine here preparing for the biggest challenge in your country's history, and then having the entire world watch every move that you make. Well, that is exactly what happened during Taiwan's latest missile exercise. Ladies and gentlemen, Taiwan recently tested its newly acquired HIMARS rocket system supplied by the United States. Well, these systems, they have gained global attention because of their effectiveness in modern warfare and their ability to strike. Now, for Taiwan, they are seen as an important part of its defense strategy against the potential future conflict. Well, the drills, they were designed to simulate a possible invasion scenario and demonstrate Taiwan's readiness to defend itself. However, reports suggest that the exercises, they were not entirely smooth, that it has sparked a lot of heated conversation about whether Taiwan is truly prepared for a type of high-intensity conflict that military planners worry about. Well, the timing, that is also very, very significant here. China continues increasing military pressure around Taiwan, conducting exercises and strengthening its capabilities. And at the very same time, Beijing is expanding relationship with regional partners while warning against what it sees as a foreign interference in Taiwan-related matters. Well, for now, these drills are about deterrence. The goal is to show that any attempt to use force, it could come at a very high cost. But for China, such exercises, they are often viewed as provocative, and for the rest of the world, the Taiwan Strait remains one of the most closely watched security flashpoints on the planet Earth. The stakes, it could not be higher. Future conflicts involving Taiwan, it would not just affect East Asia. It could disrupt the global trade, semiconductor production, financial market, and international security, and that too on a massive scale. The world is becoming more interconnected, but it is also becoming more unpredictable. Regional conflicts, they no longer stay regional. The impact, it always travels across continents, across communities and economies. And as tensions continue to rise across multiple fronts, the biggest question that remains unanswered: are world leaders moving towards diplomacy, or are they moving towards a larger confrontation that could reshape the global politics for years to come? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Driti Atri. This is Skyline. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode.